Hello, friends,
Welcome to the Liberation Chronicles. I'm Robin Parker.
and I'm Jorge Zeballos. This is another episode of the Liberation Chronicles, a series in which we hope to give voice to liberation in our current historical context and discuss what it means to build a truly inclusive society. Today, we have a special episode on the European invasion of America from the viewpoint of the Arawak people.
We're taking this alternative view, not Columbus's discovery of America, but the invasion of the land occupied by the Arawaks, because history, as Henry Kissinger said, is usually, quote, the memory of states, close quote. In his book, A World Restored, Kissinger talked about the history of 19th century Europe from the viewpoint of the leaders in Austria and England and the restoration of peace by the diplomacy of a few national leaders. But for ordinary people, factory workers, farmers, children, and women of ordinary means, the world Kissinger talked about was full of violence, hunger, and exploitation, not a world of peace at all.
So, our purpose is to invite you to see the story of history as not only the memory of states. The history of states conceals conflicts between those who dominate and those who are dominated. One reason to explore history from the viewpoint of ordinary and often subjugated people is that history told from the viewpoint of states tends to make heroes out of the people and actions that support the state, and minimize or forget the atrocities that were committed to pave the way for state progress. In accepting the state account of history, we fail to learn from atrocities such as massacres, executions, and enslavement. We bury and excuse them, and as a result, reenact them in the present.
So, with that in mind, we'd like to discuss the landing of Columbus from the viewpoints of the Arawaks. And so, let's try to understand them. The Arawak people were the indigenous inhabitants of South America and the Caribbean. They migrated from the Andes through the Amazon and Orinoco River valleys and settled in the Caribbean islands, including the Greater and Lesser Antilles, where they were also known as the Taino. They also inhabited areas that are now part of the countries of Guyana, Suriname, and Venezuela in South America. The Europeans used the term Arawak to describe indigenous people of the Americas who were not hostile to them, and they used the term Carib to describe Indian people who were hostile to them. The correct term for the Arawak, in other words, the term that they used for themselves, was actually Locono. The Locono economy centered on fishing, hunting, and agriculture. Their leaders, who were called caciques or kings, had absolute power and special privileges, including eating certain foods and receiving special treatment. Settlements ranged from small family compounds to groups of up to 3,000 people. Houses were built of logs and poles with thatched roofs. Men wore loincloths and women wore aprons of cotton fiber and palm. People painted themselves on special occasions and they wore earrings, nose rings, and necklaces, which were sometimes made of gold. The Locono had an elaborate system of religious beliefs and rituals that involved the worship of spirits, called zimmies, by means of carved representation. And their society was matrilineal. The king or cacique was succeeded by his eldest sister's son. Caciques and the lower nobility ruled over a stratified society in which slaves were the lowest tier among commoners and nobles. Today, descendants of the Locono lived primarily in the coastal regions of Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana.
To understand how a European power would land in where the Locono lived, on what is now the island of Hispaniola, you have to understand what was happening in Europe and the Middle East in the 1400s. During the time of the Mongol Empire, Europeans had a secure land route to the Silk Road, which connected them to valuable goods from India and China. However, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople, gained control over much of the region, and effectively closed the Silk Road to Christian traders. So, Europeans wanted to find another route to Asia, and while it was understood at the time that the Earth was round, they didn't correctly estimate the miles across the ocean from Europe to Asia. And they did not know that the North and South American continents existed. They thought that they could sail directly from the Iberian Peninsula to China, as shown in this map. You might wonder why Ferdinand and Isabella, the rulers of Spain, would not have taken a route around Africa to reach Asia. Well, that was because the Treaty of Alcacobas, which was signed in 1479, gave Portugal exclusive rights to exploration south of the Canary Islands. Spain was shut out of exploring the African route to Asia, as shown on the blue line in this map. The only way they could reach what they thought was Asia was an untested westerly route across the Atlantic. The treaty was a deal between Portugal's king and Isabella and Ferdinand to settle their legitimacy as rulers of Castile. King Alfonso V of Portugal had backed the former king of Castile's daughter, Joana la Beltraneja, to be ruler of Castile. Isabella was her half sister. In return for giving up the right to explore south of the Canary Islands, Joana la Beltraneja renounced her claim to the throne and was forced into a convent. After trying to convince the Portuguese to sponsor this trip, Columbus convinced Ferdinand and Isabella to do so because Spain wanted a route to Asia to trade goods and compete with Portugal. Isabella especially wanted to spread Christianity throughout the world, and the cost of the voyage seemed small in comparison to the possible riches. If successful, Columbus would become wildly rich, be given the rank of admiral of the ocean sea and viceroy and governor of all the lands he claimed for Spain. He would receive 1/10 of all the revenues from the lands forever.
Of course, we know that the expedition the Spanish undertook did not go to Asia, but first landed in 1492 in what is now called the island of Hispaniola, where Haiti and the Dominican Republic are located. Later voyages by Columbus also landed in various parts of the Caribbean. When Columbus and his party first encountered the Locono Arawaks, he quickly began seizing some as guides and planned to exploit the resources of the area, especially gold. The Spanish imposed a brutal tribute system on the Locono in their search for prosperity. Every Arawak over 14 years old was required to bring a quota of gold dust or cotton to the Spaniards. Those who failed faced mutilation by having their hands cut off or execution. Spaniards also enslaved Locono to work in mines and on plantations under the encomida system. This was essentially slavery, justified as a way to Christianize them. Conditions were brutal, long hours, little food, physical abuse. Resistance was met with massacres. In 1495, Columbus launched a military campaign against rebelling Locono, killing many and shipping others to Spain as slaves. Thousands more were executed. Las Casas, a Spanish priest who witnessed the conquest, wrote, "So excessive were the sufferings of the Indians that they fell into despair, and many committed suicide. Mothers killed their children in despair at the sufferings they had to endure." Las Casas also recounted how the Locono were hanged from gibbets in numbers of 13, referencing Jesus and the 12 apostles, and burned to death. Many died from European diseases like smallpox and measles, from which they had no immunity. Within a few decades, the Locono population in the Caribbean fell from several hundred thousand to near extinction. It is not an exaggeration to say that the Locono who encountered the Spanish during the invasion lived in a world of torture, conquest, slavery, and death.
So, what can we learn from this history of the Loconos being invaded by the Spanish, as opposed to the history of the heroic voyage of Columbus? I have a few thoughts. Number one, the notion that history is multifaceted. Gaining insight from the perspective of the conquered, oppressed, or overlooked broadens our understanding of how events unfolded, not just for the wealthy and powerful, but also for ordinary people. Number two, if we want to prevent abuses and atrocities now and in the future, we need to understand why those abuses and atrocities happened in the past. We can only learn from the past if we fully understand the complexities of past events, not just a single story from the winner's perspective. So, before we wrap it up, Robin, I wonder if we want to just check in with each other about the impact of even this short account of what that experience of the Loconos was.
Sure. Well, it's been a very interesting exercise for me in walking away from the history that I was given as I was growing up about w- the so called discovery of America. Part of it was simply bad lore. The Spanish and Europeans knew that the world was round, they just thought it was smaller and easier to reach Asia. Like many of us, I learned that havoc was reached on the indigenous people, but I didn't understand how horrible
Mhm.
that havoc was. I didn't really understand both the nature of the extinction and also the brutality. I say brutality because we have a Spanish priest, Las Casas, who talked directly about the experience that he saw. I think it's also important to note that in giving a balanced history, it's not to turn the Arawaks into perfect people. They had slavery. And unfortunately, most of what we know about the Arawaks comes from the Spanish because the Arawaks didn't have written language. And so understanding what their daily life was like can only be picked up by inference, not from their written records. Still, for me, it was really important to get this history from their viewpoint and also pick up a few nuggets about the Spanish motivation as well, parts of which I never knew,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
That, well, one of the reasons they came, as you noted, was because of a treaty they signed to secure Isabella's right to rule Castile. um, Poor Joanna, sent off to the monastery. So it's interesting how so much of the history also pivots around the use of force by noble and powerful people. I'm glad to have it, even though that feels uncomfortable, I will have to admit, because I know that this history and the other history I got brings me closer to the truth
Mhm.
of how we all got here today. What do you think?
Uh, Kind of the same as you experienced listening to that account. The other thing that happens for me is contrasting this narrative with what is still very present, maybe less so than when I was growing up, but still present. This admiration for Spain. We use a phrase in Latin America called Spain the motherland, la madre patria. To this day, there are many people that proudly refer to Spain as the motherland, which gives you a sense of how distorted the official narrative has been and how little we either know or give credence to this narrative of what the experience was for the indigenous population of the continent. So it really helps me, even though, again, for me, the reframing of the history is not a new thing. I think to see the images, to actually describe in more detail um, what really happened to this population really changes the way I center myself around that narrative. So I find it very powerful to be able to be more explicit. The naming of why would they hang 13 people? What was the significance and the connection now to religion and Christianity? And so
Yeah.
it really provides for me, a huge amount of responsibility and accountability that the church needs to take for how things unfolded under their guise. We didn't even talk about the doctrine of discovery. We know that informed so much of what happened, right? But yeah, so a lot of sort of recalibrating of what I thought I knew about that part of history.
Yeah. And before we leave, could you briefly mention the doctrine of discovery and what that meant and how that was a triple whammy for the indigenous population?
Yeah, so the doctrine of discovery is a series of bulls that the Pope would emit these bulls, which basically are pronouncements that give the faithful some kind of direction or understanding about what needs to happen. These series of bulls in the late 1400s, early 1500s, basically said to folks that were going on these voyages of discovery that any land they encountered that was occupied by non Christians, it was their duty and their right to take that land over in the name of the kingdom and Christ, because that's what Christ would have wanted. It basically set up a confrontational relationship between the explorers and anybody that they would find. And what are the chances that any of these individuals were going to be Christians if they had never been exposed to Christianity, right? So it just basically gave them carte blanche. Interesting, in one of the papal bulls, for example, it also says that if in the process of claiming the land in the name of Christ and the kingdom, they encounter resistance from the indigenous population, it was the fault of the indigenous population that they were killed in that process of resistance.
Which helps us understand, at least in part, the outright cruelty that the indigenous people who were confronted with the conquistadors faced. There is a moral cover, if you will. There's a papal bull saying, if these folks resist you, you can kill them, enslave them, and the land is yours,
Yeah,
right? So there's, your moral problem solved. Not to mention the fact that many of the sailors who came were there for money and profit. They were the lower class people who wanted to grab as much as they can. It's part of the reason that they became part of the Army and the Navy.
yeah,
Interesting.
yeah. So again, it's what we feel is a powerful recalibrating of history to be able to get a fuller picture of what happened at any historical period. So we welcome your thoughts, your comments. What do you think? Did you learn anything new about history from this episode? What surprised you? Please share with us in the comments section. Let us know your reaction to this information And also give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. We hope to see you next time. Take care, everyone.